At 11:32 on the morning of December 20th, 1943, Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown gripped the controls of his B-17 bomber over Bremen, Germany, watching 250 flak guns open fire on his formation. 21 years old, 0 combat missions completed, this was his first. The German anti-aircraft gunners below were not ordinary soldiers. They were officer candidate, school trainees, elite, the best marksmen the Luftwaffe had, and they had been waiting for the American bombers all morning. Brown's aircraft was called Ye Old Pub. It carried 10 men and 6,000 pounds of bombs. The target was a Focke-Wulf 190 fighter aircraft factory on the outskirts of Bremen. Intelligence officers had warned the crews at morning briefing that they would face hundreds of German fighters. What they did not mention was that the position assigned to Brown's bomber was the most dangerous slot in the entire formation. The men of the 379th Bombardment Group had a name for it: Purple Heart Corner, the edge of the formation, the spot where German fighters always attacked first because the defensive fire from neighboring bombers could not overlap effectively. New crews were often assigned there. Brown's crew was the newest of all. Before Ye Old Pub could release its bombs, a 20-pound cannon shell exploded directly in front of the cockpit. The plexiglass nose shattered. Temperatures at 27,000 feet were 60 degrees below zero. The wind now howled through the aircraft at over 150 miles per hour. The number 2 engine died instantly. The number 4 engine began overspeeding, forcing Brown to throttle it back to prevent catastrophic failure. The bomber slowed. The formation pulled ahead. Within seconds, Ye Old Pub was alone. German fighters saw it immediately. 12 to 15 Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s descended on the crippled bomber like wolves on a wounded deer. The attack lasted more than 10 minutes. The number 3 engine took hits and dropped to half power. The oxygen system ruptured. The hydraulic lines burst. The electrical system failed. The tail section was torn apart by cannon fire. Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, the tail gunner, took a direct hit from a 20mm cannon shell. He was killed instantly. Most of the other crew members were wounded. Brown himself caught a bullet fragment in his right shoulder. The extreme cold had frozen the oil in the defensive guns. Of the 11 machine guns mounted on the B-17, only 3 remained operational. Then the oxygen ran out. At 27,000 feet, the human brain cannot function without supplemental oxygen. Brown felt his vision narrowing. His hands went numb on the controls. Beside him, his co-pilot Spencer Luke was already unconscious. Brown's last thought before everything went black was that his crew was about to die on their very first mission. Ye Old Pub began to fall. The bomber dropped from 27,000 feet in an uncontrolled dive. The airspeed climbed past 300 miles per hour. The airframe shook violently. At any moment the wings could tear off from the stress. But then something happened that defied all logic. At approximately 1,000 feet above the ground, Brown regained consciousness. The thicker air at low altitude had enough oxygen to revive him. He grabbed the controls and pulled back with every ounce of strength he had left. The B-17 leveled out just above the treetops of northern Germany. Brown looked around the cockpit. Blood everywhere. Wounded men everywhere. His tail gunner was dead. His bomber was destroyed, and he had just flown directly over a German fighter airfield. On that airfield, a Luftwaffe pilot named Franz Stigler was refueling his Messerschmitt Bf 109. He had already shot down 2 American bombers that morning. One more kill would earn him the Knight's Cross, one of Germany's highest military honors. He looked up and saw Ye Old Pub limping across the sky at barely 100 feet. If you want to see what Franz Stigler did when he caught up to Brown's dying bomber, please hit that like button. It tells YouTube to share this story with more people. And please, subscribe if you have not already. Back to Stigler. Stigler climbed into his fighter. The engine roared to life. Within minutes, he was airborne and closing fast on the crippled American bomber. He positioned himself behind the B-17's tail, finger resting on the trigger of his twin machine guns and 20mm cannon. One squeeze. That was all it would take. The Knight's Cross would be his. But what Franz Stigler saw through his gun sight would change everything he believed about war, about honor, and about the enemy he had been taught to hate. Franz Stigler was 28 years old. He had flown 487 combat missions. He had been shot down 17 times. He had bailed out of burning aircraft 6 times and crash-landed damaged planes 11 more. His brother, August, also a pilot, had died in 1940 when his Junkers 88 crashed during a night bombing mission over England. The war had taken everything from Stigler except his skill and his code. Before the war, Stigler had been a commercial pilot for Lufthansa. He had flown passengers across Europe in peace. He had never imagined he would spend years killing men he had never met. But Germany had called, and Stigler had answered. By December of 1943, he was one of the most experienced fighter pilots in Jagdgeschwader 27. Now he was closing on the tail of a crippled American bomber, with 27 confirmed victories to his name. One more heavy bomber would complete the requirement for the Knight's Cross. The medal would honor not just him, but his dead brother. It would prove that the Stigler family had given everything to Germany. His Messerschmitt Blythe 109 G6 was not in perfect condition. Earlier that morning, during his attack on the first 2 bombers, an American .50 caliber bullet had lodged in his radiator. The engine was at risk of overheating, but Stigler had taken off anyway. The crippled B-17 was too easy a target to ignore. He approached from behind and below, the classic attack angle. His finger found the trigger. His gun sight settled on the tail section of the American bomber, and then Franz Stigler saw something that made him lift his finger away from the trigger. The tail gunner's compartment was destroyed. Through the massive holes in the fuselage, Stigler could see the body of a young American slumped over his machine gun. Blood had frozen in long red icicles from the shattered turret. The man was clearly dead. Stigler pulled his fighter alongside the bomber and looked through more holes in the aircraft skin. He saw wounded men try to help other wounded men. He saw a crewman with blood covering his face. He saw another whose leg had been torn open by shrapnel. He saw the pilot and co-pilot struggling to keep the aircraft in the air. None of them were fighting. None of them could fight. They were just trying to survive. In that moment, Franz Stigler remembered the words of a man named Gustav Rodel. Rodel had been Stigler's commanding officer in North Africa, where Stigler had flown with Jagdgeschwader 27 against the British in the Libyan desert. Rodel was a different kind of German officer. He believed that war had rules. He believed that a fighter pilot's honor came not from how many enemies he killed, but from how he killed them. Rodel had once gathered his pilots and told them something that Stigler never forgot. You are fighter pilots. First, last, always. If I ever hear of any of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself. The meaning was clear. A man in a parachute was defenseless. He could not fight back. Killing him was not combat. It was murder. And murder had no place in the code of a true fighter pilot. Stigler looked again at the shattered bomber beside him. The Americans were not hanging from parachutes, but they might as well have been. They had no working guns. They had no speed. They had no way to defend themselves. Shooting them down would not be a victory. It would be an execution. Stigler felt the weight of the rosary beads in his flight jacket pocket. His mother had wanted him to become a priest. He had chosen to fly instead, but he had never abandoned his faith. And his faith told him that what he was about to do would be a sin. He made his decision. Franz Stigler would not shoot down this bomber. He would not kill these men. He would not earn his Knight's Cross this way. But now he faced a new problem. The American bomber was flying deeper into Germany. It was heading the wrong direction. If Brown continued on this course, he would fly over more German airfields, more anti-aircraft batteries, more fighter squadrons. Someone else would shoot him down. The crew would die anyway. Stigler had spared them. But sparing them was not the same as saving them. The The German pilot pulled his Messerschmitt alongside the B-17's cockpit. He could see the American pilot staring at him through the shattered window. The young man's face was covered in blood. His eyes were filled with terror. He clearly expected to die in the next few seconds. Stigler raised his hand. He pointed down toward the ground. He was trying to tell the American to land at a German airfield and surrender. It was the only way the crew would survive. But Charlie Brown did not understand. He thought the German was telling him to go down, to crash, to die. Brown shook his head. Stigler pointed again. This time he pointed north, toward Sweden, neutral territory. If the Americans could reach Sweden, they would be interned, but alive. Medical treatment would be waiting. Brown still did not understand. He kept flying west, toward England, 250 miles across the North Sea in a bomber that was falling apart. Franz Stigler realized he had only one option left. And it was an option that could get him executed. Franz Stigler made the most dangerous decision of his life. He would not just spare the American bomber, he would escort it to safety. In Nazi Germany, this was treason. A German pilot who allowed an enemy aircraft to escape faced court-martial. If found guilty, the sentence was death by firing squad. There would be no trial, no defense, no appeal. Stigler knew exactly what he was risking. He did it anyway. He maneuvered his Messerschmitt Bf 109 into close formation on the left wing of the B-17. So close that the two aircraft were flying just feet apart. So close that from the ground, the silhouettes would merge into one shape. So close that any German anti-aircraft gunner looking up would see the distinctive outline of a Bf 109 and hold his fire. This was Stigler's plan. The Luftwaffe operated captured B-17s for training and secret missions. German ground crews were trained to recognize these aircraft. If they saw a German fighter flying in formation with an American bomber, they might assume it was one of their own captured planes being escorted. They might not shoot. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only chance the Americans had. Inside Ye Old Pub, Charlie Brown watched the German fighters slide into position beside him. His heart pounded against his ribs. He had ordered his top turret gunner, Bertrand Coulomb, to aim at the German but not fire. Brown did not understand what was happening. Was the German toying with them? Was he radioing for reinforcements? Was this some kind of trap? The B-17 continued west toward the North Sea. The German fighters stayed with it mile after mile, minute after minute. Brown kept waiting for the attack that never came. They passed over farmland. They passed over villages. They passed over roads filled with German military vehicles. At any moment, someone on the ground could look up and see them. At any moment, a flak battery could open fire. At any moment, another German fighter could appear and ask why Franz Stigler was flying alongside an enemy bomber instead of destroying it. But the minutes kept passing, and the German kept flying beside them. The coastline appeared ahead, the North Sea, 250 miles of freezing water between Germany and England. If Ye Old Pub could cross that distance, the crew would live. If the engines failed over the open ocean, they would die. But, first, they had to pass the coastal defenses. The German Atlantic Wall stretched along the entire coastline of occupied Europe. Anti-aircraft batteries, radar stations, observer posts, every mile of beach was watched. Every aircraft that crossed the coast was tracked and identified. An American bomber flying low and slow toward England would be an easy target. Stigler stayed in formation. He flew so close to the B-17 that his wingtip nearly touched the bomber's fuselage. He was daring the anti-aircraft gunners to fire. If they shot at the B-17, they would hit him too. If they recognized his aircraft, they would hold their fire. The gamble worked. The coastal batteries did not shoot. The radar stations tracked two aircraft flying in formation and assumed they were friendly. Ye Old Pub crossed over the beach and headed out over the gray waters of the North Sea. Franz Stigler had done it. He had escorted an enemy bomber through the most heavily defended airspace in Europe. He had saved 9 American lives. But Stigler could not follow them to England. His fuel was running low. His radiator was still damaged from the bullet lodged inside it, and if he landed in Britain, he would spend the rest of the war as a prisoner. He had to turn back. He had to return to Germany and pretend that none of this had ever happened. Stigler pulled his fighter alongside the B-17 cockpit one last time. Charlie Brown was staring at him through the shattered window. Their eyes met, two young men from opposite sides of a terrible war, separated by a few feet of frozen air. Stigler raised his hand to his forehead. He saluted the American pilot. Then he banked his Messerschmitt to the left and disappeared into the gray sky, heading back toward Germany. Brown watched him go. He still did not understand what had just happened. He did not know the German's name. He did not know why he had been spared. All he knew was that a man who should have killed him had chosen to let him live. But Charlie Brown's ordeal was not over. He was now 250 miles from England in an aircraft that was barely flying. 3 engines were damaged. The 4th was unreliable. The hydraulic system was destroyed. The crew had no oxygen, no heat, no working radio. 1 man was dead. 6 more were wounded. The morphine syringes had frozen solid and were useless for treating their injuries. And the North Sea in December was one of the most unforgiving bodies of water on Earth. Charlie Brown flew his dying bomber into the gray void of the North Sea. Below him, waves churned in the December cold. The water temperature was barely above freezing. If Ye Old Pub went down, the crew would survive no more than a few minutes before hypothermia killed them. The number 2 engine was dead. The number 3 engine was producing half power. The number 4 engine kept surging and fading unpredictably. Only the number 1 engine was running at full capacity. Brown needed at least 2 good engines to maintain altitude. He was flying on 1.5. The airspeed indicator showed 140 miles per hour, dangerously slow. Any slower and the bomber would stall and fall into the sea. Brown pushed the throttles forward, trying to coax more power from his damaged engines. The aircraft shuddered but held steady. Behind him, his crew was fighting to stay alive. The waist gunner, Alex Yelosenko, had taken shrapnel in his leg. The wound was severe. Without proper medical treatment, he would bleed to death. But the morphine syringes were frozen. The medical kit was useless. All his crewmates could do was apply pressure and hope. The ball turret gunner, Sam Blackford, had lost feeling in his feet. The electrical heating wires in his flight suit had shorted out during the attack. Frostbite was setting in. If he did not get warm soon, he would lose his toes, maybe his feet. The radio operator, Richard Petchout, had taken a cannon shell and fragment to his eye. He could barely see, but he kept working, trying to repair the damaged radio equipment so they could call for help. Every few minutes, he would tap out a distress signal. No response ever came. In the tail section, Hugh Eckenrode's body remained where he had died. There was no way to move him. There was no time to mourn him. The living had to focus on staying alive. Brown calculated the distance in his head. 250 miles at 140 miles per hour. Nearly 2 hours of flight time. 2 hours in an aircraft that could fall apart at any moment. 2 hours over water so cold it would kill them in minutes. He did not know if they would make it. But he knew they had to try. Mile after mile, the B-17 limped westward. The engines coughed and sputtered. The airframe groaned under the stress of holding together. Brown's hands ached from gripping the controls. His shoulder throbbed where the bullet fragment had hit him, but he did not let go. He could not let go. 9 lives depended on him. After what felt like an eternity, the coast of England appeared on the horizon. Brown had never seen anything more beautiful in his life. Green fields, gray cliffs, home. But Ye Old Pub was too damaged to reach its home base at RAF Kimballton. The hydraulic system was destroyed, which meant the landing gear might not extend, the flaps might not work. Brown would have to bring the bomber down on whatever airfield he could find. He spotted RAF Seething, home of the 448th Bomb Group, and lined up for approach. The Landing gear came down, barely, the flaps partially extended. Brown brought Ye Old Pub onto the runway in a controlled crash that tore off the remaining landing gear and sent the bomber skidding across the tarmac in a shower of sparks. When the aircraft finally stopped, Charlie Brown sat motionless in the cockpit. His hands were still locked on the controls. His body was shaking. He had done it. He had brought his crew home. 8 men climbed out of Ye Old Pub alive. 1 was carried out dead. The bomber itself would never fly again. It was sent back to the United States and sold for scrap metal. At the debriefing, Brown told his intelligence officers everything. He described the German fighter that had appeared behind them. He described how the pilot had flown alongside instead of attacking. He described the salute before the German turned away. The officers listened in silence. When Brown finished, they gave him an order. He was never to speak of this incident again. The story was classified. No one could know that a German pilot had shown mercy to an American crew. It would create sympathy for the enemy. Brown obeyed. He kept the secret. 300 miles away, Franz Stigler landed his Messerschmitt at his airfield near Bremen. He told no one what he had done. If anyone discovered that he had escorted an enemy bomber to safety instead of destroying it, he would be court-martialed and executed. Stigler kept the secret too. 2 men on opposite sides of a war, each carrying a story they could never tell, each wondering if the other had survived, each haunted by a moment of humanity in the midst of destruction. The secret would last for 46 years. The war ended in May of 1945. Charlie Brown went home to West Virginia. He finished college, then rejoined the Air Force in 1949. He served in intelligence, rising through the ranks until he retired as a lieutenant colonel in 1972. He settled in Miami, Florida, and started a combustion research company. Franz Stigler survived the war, but lost everything else. Germany was in ruins. The Luftwaffe no longer existed. Stigler had flown the revolutionary Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter in the final months of the war, but even the world's first operational jet could not save his country from defeat. After the war, he struggled to find work in occupied Germany. In 1953, he emigrated to Canada and settled in Vancouver, British Columbia. He became a successful businessman and started a new life. Both men carried the memory of December 20th, 1943. Brown often thought about the German pilot who had spared him. He wondered who the man was. He wondered why he had shown mercy. He wondered if he had survived the war. But he had been ordered to keep the story secret, and for decades he obeyed. Stigler thought about the American bomber, too. He wondered if it had made it across the North Sea. He wondered if the crew had survived their wounds. He wondered if saving them had been worth the risk, but he could never ask anyone. He could never tell anyone. The secret stayed locked inside him. 43 years passed. In 1986, Charlie Brown was invited to speak at a military aviation event called the Gathering of Eagles at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. Retired pilots from all branches of service attended. Someone asked Brown if he had any memorable combat stories. For the first time in over 4 decades, Brown told the story of the German fighter pilot. He described the shattered bomber. He described the enemy plane appearing on his wing. He described the salute before the German turned away. The audience listened in stunned silence. After the speech, something changed in Brown. He realized he needed to know what had happened. He needed to find the German pilot who had spared his life. He needed to thank him. The search began. Brown contacted the United States Air Force Archives. No records. He contacted the West German Air Force. No records. He wrote letters to military historians across Europe. No response. Months turned into years. Every lead went cold. The German pilot seemed to have vanished into history. By 1989, Brown was running out of options. He had spent 4 years searching with nothing to show for it. His friends told him to give up. The pilot was probably dead. Even if he was alive, Finding one man among millions of German veterans was impossible. But Brown refused to quit. He wrote one final letter. This time, he sent it to a newsletter for former Luftwaffe pilots called Jägerblatt. He described the encounter in detail. He gave the date, the location, the type of aircraft. He asked if anyone knew who the German pilot might have been. The letter was published in early 1990. A few weeks later, Charlie Brown received a response. The envelope had a Canadian postmark. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in careful handwriting. The letter began with 3 words that changed everything. I was the one. Franz Stigler had read the newsletter. He had recognized the story immediately. After 46 years of silence, he had finally learned that the American bomber had made it home. The crew had survived. His decision to spare them had not been in vain. Brown read the letter with tears streaming down his face. Stigler described his aircraft. He described the escort over the coast. He described the salute. Every detail matched Brown's memory exactly. There was no doubt. This was the man who had saved his life. Brown called directory assistance for Vancouver, British Columbia. He asked for a number for Franz Stigler. The operator found it. Brown dialed with trembling hands. A voice answered, an old man with a German accent. Brown identified himself. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Franz Stigler began to cry. The 2 men talked for hours. They discovered that they had been living less than 200 miles apart for decades. Stigler in Vancouver, Brown in Seattle before he moved to Miami. They had been neighbors and never known it. They agreed to meet in person that summer in a hotel lobby in Florida. 2 enemies from a war that had ended half a century ago. 2 old men who had carried the same secret for 46 years. Finally about to see each other face to face. On a summer day in 1990, Charlie Brown walked into a hotel lobby in Florida. He was 67 years old. His hair had turned gray. His body carried the scars of a war that had ended 45 years ago, but his heart was pounding like he was 21 again. Franz Stigler was waiting for him. He was 74 years old. His face was lined with age. His hands trembled slightly. But his eyes were the same eyes that had looked across at Brown through the shattered cockpit window over Germany. The 2 men saw each other across the lobby. For a moment, neither moved. 46 years of wondering. 46 years of silence. 46 years of carrying a secret that no one else would understand. Then they walked toward each other and embraced. A friend of Brown's had brought a video camera to record the reunion. The footage shows 2 old men holding each other and weeping. Their shoulders shake, their voices break. They do not let go for a long time. When they finally separated, Stigler looked at Brown, and the weight of nearly half a century lifted from his shoulders. He had wondered for so long whether his decision had mattered. Now he knew. The young pilot he had spared was standing in front of him, alive and whole. Brown had brought something to show. Stigler, photographs, not just of himself, but of his children and grandchildren. All the people who existed because Stigler had lifted his finger from the trigger in 1943. Stigler stared at the photographs, his eyes filled with tears again. He had never received his Knight's Cross. He had never been recognized by Germany for his combat achievements. But standing in that hotel lobby, looking at 3 generations of a family that lived because of him, Franz Stigler realized he had received something far more valuable than any medal. 3 months later, in September of 1990, Brown and Stigler attended a reunion of the 379th Bomb Group in Massachusetts. The veterans of Brown's old unit had invited Stigler as their guest of honor. They wanted to meet the German pilot who had saved one of their own. 2 surviving crew members from Ye Old Pub were there. Sam Blackford, the ball turret gunner whose feet had nearly frozen during the flight home. Richard Petchout, the radio operator who had taken shrapnel in his eye. Both men had lived full lives after the war. Both men had children and grandchildren of their own. They embraced Stigler with tears and laughter. They thanked him for the decades they had been given. They introduced him to their families. 25 people stood in that room who would never have been born if Stigler had pulled the trigger. The reunion made Stigler an honorary member of the 379th Bomb Group, a German fighter ace officially welcomed into an American bomber unit. Former enemies now brothers. Word of the story began to spread. Newspapers picked it up. Television stations requested interviews. Brown and Stigler found themselves invited to speak at air museums, civic organizations, and military gatherings across the United States and Canada. They traveled together whenever they could, the American bomber pilot and the German fighter, ace, standing side by side, telling their story to audiences who had never heard anything like it. Veterans in the crowd would weep openly. Young people would approach them afterward, shaking their hands, thanking them for sharing something so powerful. Stigler gave Brown a book about German fighter jets. Inside the front cover, he wrote an inscription. He explained that in 1940, he had lost his only brother to the war. He wrote that on December 20th, 1943, 4 days before Christmas, he had been given the chance to save a B-17 from destruction. He wrote that the pilot of that bomber, Charlie Brown, had become as precious to him as his brother had been. He signed it with 2 words, "Your brother." Brown and Stigler were no longer just friends. They were family. They talked on the phone every week. They visited each other's homes. They went fishing together. They celebrated holidays together. The bond between them was deeper than anything either man had experienced since the war. Their story reached audiences around the world. People wrote letters saying how much it had moved them. People said it had restored their faith in humanity. People said it proved that even in the darkest moments of war, compassion could survive. But for Brown, something was still missing. The men of Ye Old Pub had never received official recognition for what they endured on December 20th, 1943. The mission had been classified for decades. Their sacrifice had been erased from the official record. Brown decided to change that. He began writing letters to the United States Air Force. He wanted his crew to receive the medals they deserved. He wanted the world to know what they had survived. The Air Force began an investigation. Decades of classified files were finally opened. In 2008, the United States Air Force completed its investigation into the events of December 20th, 1943. The findings confirmed everything Charlie Brown had reported: the mission to Bremen, the devastating attack by German fighters, the death of Hugh Eckenrode, the wounds suffered by the crew, the miraculous flight home across the North Sea, and the German pilot who had chosen mercy over victory. The Air Force made a decision that stunned military historians. Each surviving crew member of Ye Old Pub would receive the Silver Star, one of the highest awards for valor in combat. For the crew members who had already died, the medals would be awarded posthumously to their families. 9 Silver Stars for 1 bomber crew. It was unprecedented. But the Air Force was not finished. Charlie Brown himself would receive something even rarer: the Air Force Cross, the second highest award that any member of the United States Air Force can receive. It is given only for extraordinary heroism in combat. No other World War II bomber crew had ever been collectively honored in this way. The men of Ye Old Pub became one of the most decorated crews in the history of American military aviation. 65 years after their mission, they finally received the recognition they deserved. The medal ceremony took place with great solemnity. Surviving crew members attended with their families. The families of the dead came to accept medals on behalf of fathers and grandfathers they had lost. Brown was there, 85 years old, his body frail but his spirit unbroken. And standing beside him, as he had stood for nearly 2 decades, was Franz Stigler. Stigler had received his own recognition years earlier. In 1993, the Combatants Federation of Europe had presented him with the Star of Peace. The award honored soldiers who had demonstrated exceptional humanity during wartime. Stigler was one of only a handful of German veterans ever to receive it. But Stigler always insisted that he did not deserve special praise. He had simply done what any honorable man would do. He had refused to murder defenseless men. He had followed a code that valued human life over military glory. He had answered what he called a higher call. The story of Brown and Stigler reached millions of people around the world. Journalists wrote about them in newspapers and magazines. Television programs featured their reunion. Documentary filmmakers interviewed them about their experience. In 2012, author Adam Makos published a book about their story. He called it A Higher Call. The title came from Stigler's own words about why he had spared the American bomber. Makos had spent years interviewing both men, traveling to the locations where the events had taken place, and researching military archives in the United States and Germany. The book became a New York Times bestseller. Readers were captivated by the story of two enemies who became brothers. Military historians praised the meticulous research. Veterans said it captured something essential about the nature of war and the choices men make within it. In 2014, a Swedish heavy metal band called Sabaton released a song about the incident. They called it No Bullets Fly. The song reached audiences who had never heard of Brown or Stigler. Young people around the world learned about the German pilot who had refused to kill, and the American pilot who had spent 46 years searching for him. In 2019, a surviving B-17 bomber, operated by the Erickson Aircraft Collection in Oregon, was repainted in the colors and markings of Ye Old Pub. The restored aircraft flew at air shows across the United States, keeping the memory of the original crew alive for new generations. The legacy of December 20th, 1943, had grown far beyond anything Brown or Stigler could have imagined. Their story had become a symbol of something larger than themselves. It proved that even in total war, even when nations demanded absolute hatred of the enemy, individual human beings could choose a different path. Franz Stigler had given up his Knight's Cross to save 9 American lives. In return, he had received something that no medal could represent. He had received a brother, a family, a legacy that would outlive him by generations. But by 2008, both men were growing old. Stigler was 92, Brown was 87. They had been given 18 years of friendship since their reunion, 18 years of phone calls, visits, and shared memories, 18 years that neither man had ever expected to have. Time was running out, and both of them knew it. Franz Stigler died on March 22, 2008. He was 92 years old. He passed away in Vancouver, British Columbia, the country that had given him a second life after the war. His body was cremated according to his wishes. Charlie Brown received the news in Florida. The man who had become his brother was gone. After 18 years of friendship, after hundreds of phone calls, after all the reunions and speaking tours and shared memories, Stigler had finally slipped away. Brown was devastated, but he was also at peace. He knew that Stigler had died knowing the truth. The B-17 had made it home. The crew had survived. The decision he made over Germany in 1943 had mattered. His act of mercy had rippled across generations. 8 months later, on November 24, 2008, Charlie Brown died in Miami. He was 87 years old. The two men who had met as enemies over the skies of Germany, who had become brothers across the divide of war, who had spent the last years of their lives telling their story to the world, were finally reunited. They had died the same year, just 8 months apart, as if one could not bear to live too long without the other. The legacy they left behind continued to grow. The book, A Higher Call, remained in print, introducing new readers to their story every year. The song No Bullets Fly brought their names to audiences who had never studied World War II. The restored Ye Old Pub flew at air shows across America, carrying their memory into the sky. But perhaps the most powerful legacy was the simplest one, the families. Hugh Eckenrode, the tail gunner who died over Bremen, had a grandniece who never forgot him. She tracked down a lithograph of Ye Old Pub and Stigler's Messerschmitt from a German auction house and gave it to her father. For decades, The family had wondered what had happened to their uncle. Brown and Stigler's story finally gave them answers. The descendants of the surviving crew members numbered in the dozens: children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, teachers, doctors, soldiers, artists. Every single one of them owed their existence to a German pilot who chose not to pull the trigger. At the reunions, when Stigler met these families, he was always overwhelmed. He had never expected to see the consequences of his choice laid out so clearly: a wall of faces, a crowd of lives, all because he had remembered the words of Gustav Rodel, all because he had refused to shoot men who could not fight back. Stigler once wrote a note to Brown that captured everything he felt. He explained that he had lost his only brother in 1940. He wrote that on December 20th, 1943, he had been given the chance to save a B-17 from destruction. He wrote that Charlie Brown had become as precious to him as his brother had been. He signed the note with 2 words: "Your brother, Franz." The story of Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler is not a story about war. It is a story about what survives when war is over. It is a story about honor that transcends nationality. It is a story about mercy that echoes across generations. 2 young men met in the sky over Germany in 1943. One had every reason to kill. The other had no way to survive. And in that moment, something happened that neither man could explain. Something that defied orders, defied hatred, defied everything the war demanded of them. Franz Stigler answered a higher call, and Charlie Brown spent the rest of his life grateful that he did. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We are rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about pilots who saved lives with mercy and honor. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. Are you watching? From the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Germany. Our community stretches across the entire world. You are not just a viewer, you are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you are here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler are never forgotten. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen.